Dit gebeur nie aldag dat daar so vinnig 'n vertaling verskyn in die mark. En ek gaan ook 'n bietjie meer wyer praat oor die verantwoordelikheid vir wetenskaplike verslaggewing, waarom dit nodig is dat ons as Jan Alleman bietjie moet weet van die wetenskaplikes wat om te eet en te drink en hoe om ons lewe in te rig. Dan gaan ons daarom ook praat oor hierdie boek, want die boek het 'n geweldige kontroversie veroorsaak en ek en Tim sal daaroor spekuleer. Wat is dit dan wat hierdie boek so besonders maak en waarom dit dan so 'n groot oproer veroorsaak het? Nou ek weet, ek ken vir Tim baie goed, hy is 'n Engelsman, maar hy kan Afrikaans praat. So ons gaan afskop en eers hom vra, nou maar waarom het jy hierdie boek in hierdie Afrikaans vertaal? Wat is nou so belangrik?
Wel, baie dankie Dawie en dankie Louis en baie dankie dat julle almal hier gekom het. Dis 'n plesier om hier te wees. Nou, ek het my Afrikaans in die Suid-Afrikaanse leer geleer in 1967. En dit was in Oudtshoorn in Pretoria en ek het nie so die regte Afrikaans geleer. Dit word gesê ons moet eendag Afrikaans praat en eendag Engels, maar die Engelse dag was net so kort paar woorde en toe het ons oorgeslaan na Afrikaans. Dis 'n groot plesier om hier in Stellenbosch te wees. Stellenbosch has always had a great attraction for me because of the rugby and the Marty's rugby, and I've travelled out here to watch rugby for 40 years and gone home with my tail between my legs as the University of Cape Town. But finally we sort of got getting a little bit more parity in the last few years. So it's a pleasure to have had translated the book into Afrikaans. Craig is here from the publishers, and we thought we would sell 3,000 copies. The book was printed the first day, but they thought, well, we'll just risk it and print 10,000 copies. And after 40 or 50,000 had been sold, and there was a little bit of money in a kitty, then the decision was made that it was absolutely critical that we should translate it into Afrikaans. And that's how it happened. And within literally a few weeks, these experts converted the book into Afrikaans, and it's a great privilege. And I'm glad to say it's already been number 3 on the bestsellers list. In the Afrikaans version has been number 3 on the bestsellers list in South Africa. I think it was 4th last week. So it's been a great privilege to be involved with this translation.
Yes, I must say I've travelled throughout South Africa in the past few months, and I saw your book in the big bookstores facing as the bestsellers there, and so something is either very good or there is some very controversial in your book. So it's really a privilege, and yeah, thank you very much for translating. I'm glad there was some money left in your kitty so that we could have this in Afrikaans, because we battle in this country where we don't have enough scientific publications in Afrikaans. So yes, Tim, I'd like to share with the public the importance and just get your review about it. We're scientists. I like to include myself into the same category. We don't know all the answers, but we question the answers. And you are brave enough to question your own answers. I can remember when I was part of that committee when we recommended fluid intake for athletes. I don't know how many athletes we drowned, but it was wrong. But maybe you can just share with us the ideas. We advocated the wrong fluid, and how did you manage to? You said I must tear out the pages in your book. I'm not going to do it. I'm keeping it as a historical book. But yes, you rewrote your book on the law of running on fluid replacement. What happened? We followed the guidelines from Wynnum and Stradum on Potchefstroom on fluid replacement, and how did it come about? Just to explain to the public how science is incremental and can advance.
You know, one of the keys in science, and this is what people don't understand, is anecdote. Anecdote is critically important, and we kind of ignore it at our peril. And what happened was in the 1981 Comrades Marathon, a lady collapsed in the race, and she nearly died, and she was unconscious for 4 days afterwards. And it had never been described before. And she wrote to me, and she said, what happened? And she said, my blood sodium concentration had fallen. The doctors had told her that, and she wanted to know why. And I said, I have no idea. And I spent the next 10 years, and we eventually proved that it was simply because she drank too much. She had followed the instructions that we had been giving in the past, that you must drink a lot during exercise. And she then developed this condition where she retained the water, her brain had swollen, and she'd gone unconscious. And so then I realized that that advice was wrong. And the right advice is to drink to thirst, which we've changed it. Tragically, we predicted in all the work that people would die, and it would be young women running at the back of the race, taking 6 hours to run marathons, and that's exactly what happened. And so eventually I wrote a book, Waterlogged, which showed the whole story, and it looked at all the science, and it dissected out the bad science, and how industry had influenced science. And the industry was just directing what was being told. So it was the idea that you should drink ahead of thirst was purely to drive the sales of the product. That's all it was. And industry drove the scientists and found the scientists who were narcissistic and malleable enough to be changed. And that's what they did. And tragically, 2 people died in the last 2 weeks from this condition. 2 football players in America. Completely preventable disease. But now, it's interesting that the next conversion comes directly from that. So the night I finished writing the book Waterlogged, the title at that time was The Search for the Killers of Cynthia Lucero, because Cynthia Lucero was tragically killed or died in the Boston Marathon following this advice. And the publisher said, no, I don't think we'll get by with that title. We'll all be in jail. So they changed the book and they edited it. But anyway, when I went to bed that night, I woke up in the middle of the night. My brain said to me, you must get up tomorrow morning and you must run, and you must not stop running for the rest of your life. It's not that I've not been a runner in the past. Of course, I've run lots of stuff, but I hadn't been running as frequently because of this book. And I got up and I had the worst run of my life. And I came up this tiny hill, and I reached the top, and I thought I was at the top of Mount Everest. I'm going to die. That's what I felt like. So I went home and I said, something has to change. And this is one of those moments in life which just are life-changing. And I opened my emails, and there was an advert saying, lose 6 kilograms in 6 weeks. But that wasn't what it said, because it had 2 other words. It said, without hunger. And I thought, but that's rubbish. You can't lose weight without hunger. I know that. I'm a medical doctor. And then I saw the 3 authors' names. So I was about to delete it. I saw the 3 authors' names, and I knew that they were really good scientists because I'd worked on some of the stuff they'd done in previous times. So I said, why would they say it? And then the title was The New Atkins for the New You. And so that was the book. Not this copy, this is Dawie's copy. But this was the book. And I went down and bought it, and I read it. And within 2 hours I said, you know, all this information has been hidden from our profession. It's been suppressed. And I said, that's it, I'm never eating another carbohydrate in my life. So then, you know, just to continue the story, so I had to go to to Stockholm, to talk to some elite runners. 8 weeks later, I said, you know, if I can lose 6 kilograms in 6 weeks, I'll be amazing. I'll look so much better. So anyway, by the time I got there, 8 weeks later, I was 11 kilograms lighter. And my running had just come back like this. My running went back 20 years, from 60 to 40. My times were back what I was running when I was a 40-year-old. So I was amazed, and so that kind of started it. So it was my personal anecdote. But then a lot of people have criticized me, and they've said, oh, but Dr. Noakes, you only base it on your own anecdote. Well, that's nonsense, because I then started reading. And I read all this stuff, and I read a whole bunch of other stuff, and it was clear to me that the single biggest medical problem in the world is this condition called insulin resistance. And if you have insulin resistance, you can't eat much carbohydrate. And we don't teach it at medical schools. We don't recognize it. It's astonishing.
Yes, I was involved in some research because living in the winelands, I did some the wine industry funded research on health. You know, you don't get from a pharmacological companies sponsoring research. So I was looking at wine and health, and so I did some research on the metabolic syndrome, which is actually basically insulin resistance. And there it emerged that more and more people are becoming insulin resistant, and because they are overweight and they've got slight high blood pressure and the blood sugar is slightly high, and they also have some genetic polymorphisms which does add to the problem. And you are perfectly right. You know, we are in an epidemic of diabetes type 2, which is basically the insulin. And there's just recently in the Mail and Guardian, this article that South Africa is the fattest country in the world somehow. I don't know how did they say it was. 10 out of 7 out of 10 women are overweight, and 4 out of 10 men are overweight, and 25% of our population probably has a metabolic syndrome. So yes, from a medical point of view, we are sitting on the tip of the iceberg. You know, we are creating a generation which is insulin resistance, is high insulin, and insulin is an anabolic hormone which actually is very bad for our health. It stimulates proliferation of the endothelial of the arteries, and the sugar tends to raise, and high blood sugar, actually carbohydrates stimulate the creation of the bad cholesterol, the small dense and triglycerides and small dense LDL cholesterol, which actually can damage and the arteries, and that's where heart attacks comes from, not from cholesterol. So we are glad that you saw that, and this will change the way we think about health in the future.
Sure. So you see, we've been so dogmatically talked about the cholesterol theory of heart disease. And would you know there's essentially no evidence that model is true? Essentially no evidence.
Yes, I would like to support you there, because in our research, many of the patients or candidates in our research project were on cholesterol-lowering agents, and they were starting to complain of muscle aches and pains, and I started to do their CPKs, and it was sky high. They had muscle breakdown. And then recently, there came in publications, I think 4 or 5 I read already, of premature Alzheimer's disease. Your brain is full of cholesterol. so we're just waiting for all the publications to come out. The adverse effects of certain cholesterol-lowering agents, and just to put the record straight, certain people have to go on cholesterol-lowering agents. The statins are actually indicated for people with familial hypercholesterolemia, and certain genetic abnormalities. There are about 400 LDL receptor abnormalities that might need this, but this can be identified in a family history and very high cholesterol. But most people with heart attacks actually have normal cholesterol. And there I want to support you. More and more publications come out that cholesterol is an association but not a causation. So it's absolutely untrue that Ansel Keys, now this is what I want to say, this 7-country study by Ansel Keys actually sparked off this whole diet pyramid of the Americans that said that carbohydrates must be the base of the pyramid, and that's where it is. In 1977 this all started. So how did this happen? How did Ansel Keys, he's not even a medical practitioner, how did he get it to influence the whole medical profession?
Well, Ansel Keys was a very driven man, and I think he had decided what the cause of the heart disease epidemic was. And the heart disease epidemic is suddenly identified when President Eisenhower has a heart attack in 1955. And all of a sudden, if your president has a heart attack, then there's a lot of concern. And in fact, the heart disease rates start to rise at the end of the First World War. And they rise, and they in fact peak in 1968, and then they disappear. And in fact, heart disease is disappearing, which is a really paradox. It's the actual number of new cases is disappearing. And some people predict it'll be disappeared in 20 years. But yet when you look at reports, they say heart disease is the most common disease. It's not. Diabetes is much more prevalent. Anyway, he decided that it was fat in the diet. And the reason why fat became the dominant factor was because cigarettes absolutely completely track the heart disease rates. The smoking consumption absolutely tracks it. The smoking incidence starts to fall in the 1960s and so on thereafter. But there was a smoking lobby, so no one was going to say it was smoking. And sugar also tracks it. But there's a sugar lobby, so no one was going to talk about sugar. So the only thing left was fat. And so fat got demonized. And as soon as they demonized fat, they then said we must take saturated fat out of the diet and eat vegetable oils. And there's a vegetable oil industry in the United States of America, the most powerful lobby of any lobby in the United States. And they demonize fat. So if you are concerned that saturated fat is causing heart disease, it's because of the effects of the edible oil industry and their lobby in the United States. And I can tell you that there are 3 things you don't want to eat. One is sugar, one is flour, and one is vegetable oil. It is that those 3, if you're really looking for a toxic combination, that's it.
Yes, I can so vividly remember. I was a child when margarine started. It was white when it came out, and then they had to change the color because it got to look like butter. And so they add artificial coloring and they hydrogenated all these oils and they make trans fatty acids, and then they realized it's unhealthy. Then they added canola oil and omega-3 oils, and it's still unhealthy, but they think it's healthy. Anyway, I'm back to butter because I mean the Time magazine said we eat butter. So I believe what is written in Time is true. So anyways, what amazes me as I've been in the medical education field as an academic for 40 years, and doctors, the medical profession regulates itself by have compulsory CME, continuing medical education lectures for all doctors. We have to accumulate points. I was forced to accumulate my own points last year. Unfortunately, got enough. But to attend lectures and to say that you stay abreast with the thing, but how did it come about that doctors didn't know about this cholesterol thing, and how were they brainwashed?
Yeah, because Keys became the American Heart Association in 1957. He was not on a committee. They looked at his data and they said it's nonsense. You can't prove anything by association. So his study showed that countries which had more fat in the diet had higher rates of heart disease, and that's purely associational. Now, unfortunately, associational studies the nutrition is based on associational studies. And so what we'll do is we'll take a population, and 40 years earlier, we'll ask them on one day what they ate, or maybe if we're lucky, we'll ask them what they ate for 7 days. And then when they die 40 years later, the scientists will come along and they will look into the data and say, okay, let's look at ovarian cancer. What were the people eating that might have caused ovarian cancer? Notice they say caused. But you can't prove causation by association. So then they found that the people who ate macadamia nuts all died of ovarian cancer. So they say, okay, it's macadamia nuts which cause ovarian cancer. But they don't understand that to eat macadamia nuts, you have to do a whole bunch of other stuff. And so it's the association of a whole range of factors. Now, unfortunately, there's one guy, Walter Willett, in America, who's published 3,000 associational studies. And he's published it as if it is science. And he's published it in the New England Journal of Medicine as if it is science. And the New York Times quotes every single study that he publishes as if it's science. It is not science. Science is when you take a population and change their diet and see what happens over the next 40 years. There has not been, and there never will be, a perfect diet study, because we have to put 40,000 people in jail for 40 years and feed them one diet and give the others another diet, and they're not allowed to change one other thing, and you can't do it. So what the US government decided 30 years ago was we'll do the opposite. We'll just do associational studies and claim it's causation, and that's great because then they can manipulate it. You see, if I'm working for the grain company, as I might be, I'm much more likely to look for a grain relationship to health in my data. I will search for it, or if I'm funded by the meat industry, and that's what they do. And unfortunately, Dr. Willett is strongly biased towards grains. So all the data that came out from his career was grain-based. It was grains were good and meat was bad. And it may be true that grains are good. I don't think it is. But healthy people in the 1970s were told to eat grains. And they ran marathons and they did all these things. So how do you know it's the grains that made them healthy, or it was the fact that they were running marathons?
I'm glad that I'm not one of those research patients, because when I met him, I saw this rat running on this treadmill. You know, come on, you rat! He's got to run for 8 hours a day, and he get a diet that you prescribed. I don't know what you fed him, but it must have been sugar. But shame. Okay, just to put the record straight, there are 2 organs in the body that need sugar. And that's the brain and the testicles. That's interesting. I read this morning at 4 o'clock. So your brain can only metabolize glucose. Okay, and so there is good reason for the medical profession to use glucose. So, and I can remember my neighbor was a patient of mine, and she was unconscious, and I thought she had a heart attack or some different thing. But she could only say sugar. I don't know if she was a diabetic. She took too much insulin. and I injected this insulin, and she sat up there. And I think that's hypoglycemia is a potential legal condition. Bernard Rose, I think he also stumbled or was
that's right.
in the marathon because of low blood sugar. So low blood sugar definitely has a problem if you are mad enough to run marathons and stuff, or insulin injections too much. But now let's go to your book. I think in all respect, you were unfortunately by the media quoted wrongly many times, and I had the privilege to listen to a lot of the interviews. Let's put the record straight. And your diet is not a high-fat, high-protein, low-carb. It's a high-fat, moderate-protein, low-carb diet. And we must say that all fats are not equal. I mean, the monounsaturated, polyunsaturated, and omega-6. So one must make a distinction against all the good and the bad fats. And it is true that carbohydrate is not an essential food. So you can come by without eating sugars. There is this notion that carbohydrate is addictive. Can you say something about that?
Yeah, I think that it's very clear that sugar is highly addictive. So sugar is the most addictive drug that we have in our society, and it's freely available. It's more addictive than cocaine, heroin, everything. And I hope people understand that. It acts through the same pleasure centers in the brain. And a lot of the problems we have in nutrition are because we took the fat out and we put the sugar in. And the industries, the processed food industries, realized this was a godsend because now they could addict everyone to their food. And that's what they've been doing for the last 30 years. Yeah, when you go to the checkout counter and you see all those sweets, every single sweet there has been developed by PhD experts. And they look for what's called the bliss point. And they design the food so that when you eat it, you will be addicted to it. And you will want to eat more. And you'll come back for more tomorrow. So the real cause of the obesity epidemic is the processed food industry, using sugar as an addiction. And that's the cause. So if you want to reverse obesity, we have to take processed foods and those addictive foods out of the foods chain. But I think carbohydrates themselves are also addictive. And one of the in the book we say, you must limit your carbohydrate intake. If you're very healthy, you can have 200 grams a day. If you're insulin sensitive, you don't need more than 200 grams a day. But if you're insulin resistant, you need to eat 25 grams or so. And that's what I eat. But the people who with morbid obesity that we've cured, in other words, they no longer, they lose 100 kilograms or 80 kilograms. They don't need surgery. They don't need anything. All they need to do is cut the carb to 25 grams and no sugar. And once they start lifting, the carbohydrate goes up a little bit to 50 grams, they start overeating again. And that's the addiction. And we all have that. I think that the reason the diet works so well for weight control is because each of us has an addictive threshold. And if we go above that threshold, we will always be hungry and we'll always overeat. And for some people, it might be 200 grams of carbohydrate, then they'll be perfectly well. But for me, it's 25 grams. And for the morbid obese people we treat, it's 25 grams. And if they go to 30 grams, they start overeating again. And it's not just a sugar effect, it is carbohydrate as well.
Yes, I can, we'll just tell the audience that everybody here has got a different genetic makeup. So we do differ. We can't say that one size fits all. I happen to know that me and you has got the same genetic abnormality. You've got insulin resistance, fortunately. I don't think I have, but so there are about 25% of people sitting here might have ApoE4 polymorphism, which is a minor nutrient, a minor genetic abnormality which put you at risk to develop diabetes or insulin resistance. So not everybody is insulin resistant. Some people never get it, so the diet might not work for everybody. But for most people, it could be a very, very good way to normalize your insulin and your blood glucose. There are a few things that we have some reservations, well, myself. You tell us to limit fruit intake, because it's high in glucose and fructose. Now, we know that glucose has got a high GI, glycemic index, but fructose is very low. But again, fructose in the form of corn syrup could be very bad, because that our problem is that if you limit your fruit intake, you actually exclude a lot of phytonutrients and vitamins and antioxidants, which might be very essential to prevent cancer and heart disease and other types of disease. Now, how do you justify to limit your fruit intake? Because I think we should eat more fruit.
Okay, so the biggest cause of cancer is carbohydrate and diabetes. So that's you've all been told that fat drives cancer. It's rubbish. It's carbohydrate drives cancer, and diabetics are particularly prone to both cancer and dementia. So my point of view might be that if you aren't eating a high carbohydrate diet, you're reducing your risk of cancer as low as you possibly can. And maybe you need all those phytonutrients if you're eating a high carbohydrate diet. I mean, that's just one explanation. But the key is you have to decide what you're going to die from. You know that, and it's going to be diabetes for most of us. It's not going to be cancer. You know that's a surprising point and people can't get their head around it. The biggest cause of mortality in the Western Cape is diabetes. It's not heart disease. It's not cancer. It's diabetes and all its complications. So we don't say limit. We say limit the carbohydrate, the fruits that have got a lot of carbohydrate in them. And we say eat lots of berries because they're low carbohydrate and high nutrients. But you can get all the nutrients you need from kale. Vegetables actually have more nutrients than fruits. So that would be the argument.
Yeah, I think we would still advocate a diet high in fruit and vegetables. And my grandma said your plate must look like a rainbow, you know, the red and green and yellow stuff. We know that fructose in its pure form could be very detrimental for health and actually can cause insulin resistance and gout. But the fructose in fruit is linked to fiber and other nutrients, so I still would advocate a diet high in fruit and vegetables. What we do have a problem here is why not eat your carrots and stuff that grows under the ground? I think I read in your book your carrots and potatoes and beetroot. How the heck can I cut it out?
It's again, people have to understand that if you have metabolic syndrome, insulin resistance, or morbid obesity, the cut point of how much carbohydrate you can allow is so small. And one potato is going to be 12, 13, 14 grams, and that's it. That kicks you on the wrong side. One potato. You know, one glass of orange juice is going to be 20 grams of carbohydrates, which is your daily allowance. And people don't understand it, so that they go to people who advise them to lose weight. They say, you know, fruit's very good. I'm not trying to criticize what you're saying. You must have an apple and a banana. That's 50 grams of carbohydrate. That's twice what I'm allowed. You know? And if I eat that, my glucose control is completely out of the sky. You know, that. I was at a conference last week or the week before in Melbourne, and we were discussing diabetes, and we were presenting the argument that diabetes is a completely preventable disease. We do not have to have one patient with diabetes in the country if we restricted carbohydrate intake in people who've got the genes. And we had people talking about how exercise is key in regulating diabetes, and they then showed the blood glucose concentrations, and they were just off the charts. I said, you know, if my value is up there, I would be in a cold sweat all day. But that's normal. And of course it's normal if eating high carbohydrate diets. And that's the problem. Just take a potato and measure your glucose, and you'll be astonished. It goes up to 11 or 12. If my glucose goes above 6 and I'm diabetic, I get nervous. Yeah. Because you can't allow it to go above 6.5. You have to get it below 6.5 if you're diabetic. And even if you're healthy, every time it goes above 6.5, it's producing all this damage.
Yeah, I think from a clinical point of view, if you treat, some of you people might have children with type 1 diabetes. That's an underproduction of insulin. And all type 1 diabetes, you see, the first thing you notice your child lose weight. And if you give them insulin, they pick up weight. I mean, so insulin drives glucose into the fat stores, and fat cannot be converted to fat. Yeah. So this is the problem about carbohydrate and sugar. When you eat sugar and you don't exercise, we're not all mad enough to run marathons. Your insulin will drive this into the cells, and if you're insulin resistant, then you will have a high insulin, and the insulin as an anabolic hormone has damaging effects, and that causes all the hyperinsulinism actually causes all the problems. And you get inflammation in your body. So we meet those inflammatory markers, the CRPs. Now, from a medical point of view, we do have access to all these markers of damage. And so we now see that diabetes is not a one disease. It's linked to cancer, it's linked to heart disease, and there are inflammation somewhere in the body. So, yes, we are amazed at we do in medical science have the advantage of doing more and more research. Another question I have is the so-called Mediterranean diet. We hear about the Mediterranean diet. As far as I can recollect, that's also a high-fat diet. It's about 40% fat.
Yeah, that's one of the problems. You see, when Ansel Keys decided he was going to promote Mediterranean diets, he went to Crete because the Crete people had the longest lives and the lowest heart disease rates. And he said in his protocol he had to study 3,000 people from Crete and check what they were eating. Turned out they got down and did about 30. And they lost the data. So then they had to manipulate it and come up with some other story about what the Cretians were actually eating. So that's been exposed in a book called The Big Fat Lie. Sorry, Big Fat Surprise. Big Fat Surprise by Nina Teicholz, which was really the stimulus for that Time magazine article. Although she wasn't quoted, it was when her book came out that Time ran that story. And so she showed that Keys was a shocking scientist. He did only associational studies and his data were appalling. And he also went to the Mediterranean countries in Lent. And the Lent, people don't eat saturated fat. If you're Greek or Orthodox, you don't eat saturated fat in Lent. So any data that he got was going to be skewed. But if you know, the Mediterraneans eat a lot of fat and they eat a lot of protein. And the only question is maybe they do have a bit of grains, but they have a higher fat diet. And now there is one study in the literature showing a small effect of a Mediterranean diet in over 8 years. The mortality rate or the heart attack rate was slightly lower, but the end result was the same. The all-cause mortality wasn't changed. And so my great friend Lionel Opie says, you see, Mediterranean diet's the only proven diet. You can't talk about any other diet. But the Mediterranean diet is moving towards the diet we're suggesting because it has more fat. And therefore its effect may be because it has more fat. But even then, the Mediterranean diet had a very small effect. And in medicine now, one of the key changes in the last 10 years is we can now judge all different interventions and quantify how good they are. And it's called the number needed to treat. So if we can, let's say we take statins or a diet or exercise. The question is how many people have got to start running marathons for one of them to benefit? And that's called the number to treat. And I don't think we know the answer. But we do know for statins. For statins, if you're a healthy male, with a high cholesterol as your only risk factor, 1 in 140 benefit. 1 in 140, so 139 do not benefit. So that's the number needed to treat. So then anything better than 1 in 140 is better for you than taking a statin. And it turns out the Mediterranean diet's like about 1 in 100 or something like that. So even if we would take 100 people and convert them to the Mediterranean diet, only one would benefit. But I can assure you, if you take 100 people with the metabolic syndrome and you put them on this diet, you're going to get 100% are going to benefit. And that's the problem that we can't understand. Of course, if we take 1,000 people, we're only half of them are going to have metabolic syndrome. So only 50% are going to benefit profoundly. But once you target in on people with insulin resistance and you give them this diet, they all benefit. Yeah.
And I think the other problem was that Ansel Keys omitted the study, the countries that had high fat, like the French eating this foie gras, what is this, the livers, and the Germans eating wurst, so they left out those countries, and they had low heart attack. And Switzerland eating cheese like anything.
Right. Yeah, so I didn't finish your answer because Ansel Keys in 1957. The American Heart Association says, no, it's rubbish. There's association. It's not proof. By 1961, the American Heart Association reversed that opinion. They said there's proof that fat causes heart disease. And the only thing that changed was Keys was now on the committee. And he was driving the committee. And he surrounded himself with 6 other people. And they all led this whole thing because they then went and controlled the research funding for the next 20 years. All the cholesterol guidelines were developed by these 6 people. And that's who we have to thank for the problems that we have today.
Yeah, and of course there are socio-political reasons as well, because wheat is a recent addition to our diet, and it's a cheap food stuff for the poorer communities, and it's to feed the people. They had to bake bread and make pastas, etc. Now, early this morning at 5 o'clock, somebody sent me the China study. I read through it, but to give us some indication, what was that study? He was a vegetarian, was he?
Dr. Colin Campbell claims that he's done the best nutrition study in the world, and it's
actually, I just want to say I got a letter that he said that what Tim Noakes said is total rubbish.
No, he reviewed Real Meal Revolution. Colin Campbell. Yeah. So what he did was he also did associational studies. He looked at what people were eating in China, and then what their mortality rates in that area, and he tried to link the food type to what the people were eating. And he said that anyone who ate animal fat were dying of cancer, etc. And it was garbage, because when you actually look at the data very carefully, it's not true. Because the ones who were eating the animal fats were actually doing better. But his bias was so powerful that he couldn't see it. But don't believe me, just type in on Google Denise Minger, M-I-N-G-E-R, and the China study. And she goes through the whole study and looks at it and just destroys it completely. But again, it's an associational study, so even if it did find an association, it's meaningless.
Yeah, it's interesting that we get all of these type of people. Actually, when I read this book and said, you mustn't believe anything in your book, I mean, I don't know how scientists can realize that, but it did create a lot of interest, and I must say, to your credit, a lot of the people didn't even know about what you're saying. There are some criticisms. This is just an ego trip for Professor Noakes, and he's going to retire. He needs money. What are you going to do with all the money you make with the selling of this book?
Yeah, well, that's easy, because all the money that comes from the books I've written from day one goes to a trust. And I fund a senior researcher at the University of Cape Town. So you know what a senior researcher costs, and that is from the income from the investment that I put into. So anyone who knows anything about investment will tell you that's quite a lot of money has been invested already.
Yeah, okay, I will be able. I just asked that question because people say no, he's just making money.
So anyway, all the money, and Craig will tell you this because Craig he sends the checks through, and the check goes to the Noakes Foundation, and the Noakes Foundation was formed to fund nutritional research, and we're hoping that eventually we'll have enough money to fund research every year on an ongoing basis. But important research, you see, that frustrates me. You see, that the research is not being done that needs to be done. There's a Nobel Prize out there. Absolutely. You know, I don't know if Dr. Gerard Schoonby, there he stands right at the end there. There's a man who reversed his type 2 diabetes and a whole lot of other conditions, which of course we all know is irreversible. He's a medical doctor. He did it. He didn't lie to us. He knows. And now all you have to do is take people like Dr. Schoonby and see, now, what's your metabolic profile now? And then we start to, so we know what it's like. And then people like myself who haven't reversed their type 2 diabetes, and see what's the difference. Why was he able to reverse his type 2 diabetes and I wasn't? What's the metabolic difference? What's the genetic difference? And then we take 100 people and we put them on the most rigorous intervention. We make them eat 25 grams of carbohydrate a day, and we do all sorts of other things. We make them exercise. I'm talking about type 2 diabetes. And we'll reverse the disease in 30% of the people, I suspect, maybe 40%. And if we study them carefully before and carefully after, we'll see what caused the problem. And we'll be able to show it was the carbohydrates in specific individuals. And that's a major breakthrough. Because if you look at the literature, they say, we don't know what causes type 2 diabetes. We don't know. But You can prove it.
Yeah, we can prove it. Well, we've got to wrap up suddenly. My interest in research came from Ta-Nehisi Hannibal. She was a fruitarian for 40 years. And I promise you there was nothing wrong. I actually saw the research done by Professor Bern Meyer. The only thing they could find wrong was, so they didn't say it was wrong, but she had an alkaline urine, so she had an alkaline diet. But she said a very interesting thing, because she interviewed a professor in nutrition. I wouldn't say from which university, but you've got close links. But she said to Ta-Nehisi, but if what you say is true, I've got to discard half of my books. And Ta-Nehisi said, my skin would eat, doctor. Yeah, I'm sure there are many people with specific questions here, and just to say that we are a lot of academics, we know what it is to be a full-time academic. We don't get a lot of money, but we don't work for money, we work for science. So we'd like, are there anybody with a burning question here? Yes?
I have a microphone, can I just bring it to you? We can allow 2 questions, and depending on the length of the answer, maybe 3.
I want to know whether you've made the link with the blood group, because the O blood group, your diet is absolutely right for that group. That's my question.
Yeah, and the O group is the most common
Yeah.
group, so that would also be, just by chance, that would be likely. So in my view, there is a genetic basis, as David says, for what you should be eating. So we all can eat only determined by our genes, but we're not sure what genes those are yet. And my point is that it's the pre-diabetic genes, or the genes that promote diabetes, that are the ones that would make you eat this diet and benefit from it. They're not directly linked to the ABO blood groups. So it's a chance finding that most people are O and most people are insulin resistant. Therefore, more people will benefit from this diet if they're O group. Yeah.
Any more questions that you
Someone
need
at this side, they want a question?
clarification?
Yeah. Here's one. There. Okay, I'll bring the mic.
Mr. Noakes, I'm one of those runners that ate carbs all the time. I want to ask you, can you just maybe give us some guidelines of, if you say high fat, just more or less what type of fat? And
thank you very much. You know, because
of your daily meals.
The problem with this description is it's wrong. And this is a low carbohydrate diet. That's the one thing you have to do. You have to cut your carbohydrates. You see, so I was debating with a guy a few weeks ago, and he said, I'm criminal, you see. And but the trouble is, he weighs 120 kilograms, and I weigh 80 kilograms. Now, who do you think is eating more fat in their diet? He is. Because his consumption will be 50% higher than mine. So even though a high proportion of my diet is fat, he's eating a lot of fat because he's eating more calories than I am. And that's the problem. So I reduced my calories by at least 35% when I went onto this diet. So I might be eating exactly the same number of grams of fat. The grams of fat may be exactly the same as they were in the past. But the source will be totally different. In the past, it would have been from baked foods and things which I didn't know about, that they're full of fat. So I eat absolutely very little now. I mean, that's astonishing how little you need to eat. I didn't know that. And so I eat lots of butter and macadamia nuts and avocados and coconut oil and eggs and dairy. Those are my main sources, and fish. Those will be my main sources of fat. And it could well be that my fat is 70%, but it's not actually a hang of a lot of fat because I'm eating so little. And that's the point. It isn't a high fat diet. As by proportion, it's a high percentage of fat. Yeah. And can I just make the point that, sorry, just to finish up the story. We're taught, that saturated fat, that lovely lamb from the Karoo, and you eat the fat there, the saturated fat, goes straight to your coronary arteries and blocks them. That's what we're told by the cardiologist. And that is garbage. Because it is utter garbage. Because fat metabolism is much more complex than that. When you take fat and you're not eating carbohydrate, that's the key. When you're not eating carbohydrate, because there's 2 different ways you metabolize fat. If you've got carbohydrates with it, you do it differently. So you take this fat, it goes into the gut, it's digested, and it's absorbed into what's called the thoracic duct. And that takes the packets of fat are stored as called chylomicrons, and they travel up there, and then they go into the bloodstream, and they distribute to all your fat cells. So the saturated fat that you ate for breakfast is now sitting in your fat cells. It's nowhere near your coronary arteries, and it's got no cholesterol tied with it whatsoever. No cholesterol at all. What next happens is the cells need cholesterol all the time, and they need the fat to build the cholesterol. So that now you release the fat from your fat cells, it goes to the liver where cholesterol is added and triglycerides are added, and that's where you make the cholesterol. You don't make the cholesterol from the food that you eat. It doesn't go directly from there. And you add it from carbohydrates or from fats. And if you're eating a high carbohydrate diet, you can produce plenty of cholesterol as well. And then you get a whole bunch of other abnormalities. And so what happens when you eat a high carbohydrate diet, you get inflamed and you get insulin, then you mess up your cholesterol metabolism. And that's what causes your death. Yep.
I can just add to that, fat gets metabolized, and if you eat a high-fat diet, low-carbohydrate diet, you lose ketones in the urine, you become keto acid. And the ketones is a high-calorie,
exactly.
so you lose actually more calories than when you eat sugar. So that is why we lose so much weight on a fat diet. The ketonuria is actually losing a lot of calories, so that is basic. Well, I'm so glad that we could have this opportunity to speak to Tim. That is really a privilege here to have you here on this side of the Riesbeek River. It's really difficult to get him. We don't need rugby only to get Tim here. But we wish him luck and success with your future. I'm sure everybody here wants to buy a book. So Tim, you will be available for signing of the book?
Yes, indeed. I'll certainly be happy to sign. So thank you all very much. I appreciate you being here.